Final Fantasy VII Remake was one of the most anticipated games in recent memory, and it was viewed as a good but flawed game by most people, myself included. The combat was great, and fans praised the updated looks and fleshed out personalities of our previously blocky little polygon heroes. However, pacing in side quests left a lot to be desired. But it was the added content that was especially hit and miss with fans, specifically the ending and changes made to the narrative. I feel like Remake bit off more than it could chew when they decided to make the entire first game just the Midgar section. Decent chunks of Remake felt like nothing but gameplay padding and filler. With Rebirth, we have an objectively all-around better game and really one of the best Final Fantasy titles in general. Just like Remake, Rebirth's ending is the game's main talking point and also the main dividing line in the fanbase. Instead of starting this video from the beginning, let's start from the ending and talk about that first, then work our way back to the other topics. Real quick before we get into this is my take on Rebirth's ending. Until we get the third game, we won't have all the answers to know what's actually going on. This is my personal interpretation, and I can clearly be as right or wrong as anyone else out there. With that said, let's get started. To unwrap Rebirth's ending, we need to first take a look back at how we got here. I hated the ending of Remake when I first played it, but that was just my initial reaction. I'll never forget the first time I beat the game. It was during lockdowns, and the company I worked for at the time closed my location for good rather than just shutting down temporarily. As a result, I had zero responsibility for the near future, and that meant I could stay awake all day and night playing Remake, so that's exactly what I did. I was loving the game when I finally got it. The characters were perfect, and minus some really unpolished background textures, it looked gorgeous. I felt like I was reliving my childhood. But there were cracks in the foundation of the narrative here and there. Sephiroth was showing up a lot more than I thought he needed to, and there were lines here and there said that the player wasn't supposed to know yet. Cloud mentioning that he killed Sephiroth with his own hands, or Hojo saying that Cloud was never in Soldier. These were late game plot twists and major story beats. What the hell were they doing casually bringing it up as early as Midgar? And what's the deal with the whispers? These things are too involved to not end up being a big deal. But I kept playing and not worrying about it, until I got to the endgame. It was getting late, but because of that whole worldwide sickness thing that I don't know if YouTube still flags videos for or not, I didn't have shit to do, so I kept playing through the whole night. As the hours went on, the game got more and more ridiculous. So much so that by the final chapter, I didn't feel like I was playing Final Fantasy VII anymore. When the credits finally rolled and everything was said and done, I vividly remember standing up and not knowing what to think. Standing there and staring at my TV for a couple minutes trying to gather my thoughts. Eventually, I also remember quietly saying out loud, "They ruined it." Thinking this isn't what anyone wanted. The compilation of Final Fantasy VII was different. Clearly, I wanted that to be good too when it came out years ago, but if it wasn't, who cares? It's just more underachieving sequels. It's not the original product that I was attached to. But Remake, this was the remake. This was the start of a decade-long release cycle that was bringing the thing I was attached to into the modern times. Only this wasn't the thing I was attached to anymore. It had all the same characters and told a lot of the same story elements, but now this was something different too. It was a massive letdown. Years before this, I also remember coming home from work one day, opening up YouTube, and seeing a thumbnail that just said Final Fantasy VII Remake trailer. After all the years of rumors and fake outs, they were really doing it. I remembered watching hours of videos of people freaking out and grown-ass men literally crying over that same trailer. And none of us got what we thought we were getting. I had to get out and clear my head. I grabbed a couple coffees, then just drove around for a bit since there were no cars on the roads. Just thinking about what I had played and trying to piece it all together. Then something really strange started to happen. The more I thought about it, the more I started liking it. I came back home, got a much needed nap, and I immediately started up a New Game Plus run to pick up on details that I had missed, and there were a lot. After my second playthrough, that initial disappointment was gone, and instead I was completely on board with the changes to the narrative. Regardless of what the game was called, what it was marketed as, and what it said on the box art, this was not a remake at all. It was a sequel. This was basically Final Fantasy VII Part 2. Everything in the original PS1 game had still happened. Everything that happened in Advent Children, in the compilation, and the short stories that bridged the gap between the two had still happened. While there was a weird time-traveling Sephiroth element, that didn't stop those original events from already taking place. A big part of the post-PS1 Final Fantasy VII story revolves around Sephiroth not fusing with the lifestream like he's supposed to after his death at the Northern Crater, still being technically alive in some metaphysical form throughout. And now it seems that Remake Sephiroth eventually gains control over the lifestream to the point that he can manipulate the flow of time itself. This meant that Sephiroth knows he's always fated to lose to Cloud. He's always going to be defeated in the past during the Nibelheim incident. He's always going to be defeated in the present at the Northern Crater. He's always going to be defeated in the future during Advent Children. Think about that for a second. For Sephiroth to achieve such an understanding of the lifestream that he can manipulate his own memories throughout time, he likely had to relive those 3 defeats at Cloud's hands dozens, if not hundreds of times, living in a Groundhog's Day style loop until he found out how to crack the code. It's what Sephiroth means after the initial bombing run, when Cloud has that out-of-place line about having already killed him. You need not remind me, is Sephiroth being a cheeky little bitch because he's already had to witness himself lose over and over again for God knows how long until he could spring a new plan into action. That's actually a pretty fucking cool premise. Throughout the game, we also learn that Aerith has some of the same foresight abilities, but I got the feeling that she didn't know quite as much as she thought she did. She just knows that Sephiroth has the worst intentions and he needs to be stopped. But this plays right into Sephiroth's plan. When you defeat the Whispers and break Fate, you're actually helping Sephiroth. The entity of Fate has been that missing link that Sephiroth discovered. The thing that, in the end, always gave Cloud an edge in their battles. Again, that's not a bad idea if you wanted to retell the story, but also wanted to add in some new elements. It feels extremely jarring at first, but it's actually piggybacking off of already established ideas of Sephiroth and Aerith's journey through the lifestream that were put into the compilation project years prior. When I thought about it and had it more figured out, I actually really liked this new take on the narrative. But there was one massive elephant in the room that kept me from being overly excited about these changes: the reappearance of Zack. More so than any of the crazy stuff beforehand, Remake's ending left significantly more questions than answers because of that one scene with Zack. Yeah, the stuff with Sephiroth and the Whispers wasn't completely explained, but I felt like I figured out enough about the situation to have an idea of what they were setting up. With Zack, one thing was clear though. We weren't just dealing with Sephiroth time-traveling the lifestream, but we were very likely dealing with a Final Fantasy VII multiverse. And that part I wasn't on board for. Not at all. There are definitely exceptions to the rule, but I tend to really dislike the whole time travel / multiverse plot elements because it's essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card for any narrative. Clearly in the real world, whether you believe these abstract ideas of time travel and parallel universes can exist or not, we don't have an understanding of the physics behind any of it. This means that the writers can do whatever the hell they want, and they can then undo whatever the hell they want later in some dumb, convoluted, and unrewarding way that almost always negates what are supposed to be impactful plot points. Time travel and multiverses eliminate the threat of believable loss or danger in a narrative. Anything bad that happens can be undone somehow, which in turn programs the viewer's brain to have less of a personal investment in what they're watching. No specific event or death is final, and that significantly hinders immersion. To be blunt, it just changes how much of a fuck you give about what's happening in the story. Because of this, it is one of the worst storytelling tropes in my opinion. My main issue with the Zack tease being, why introduce him and a parallel universe if you don't intend on joining him and or multiple versions of already established characters at some point? It's the whole Chekhov's gun rule. If you're going to present it as important information, it needs to be used as something important. With all that said and the setup out of the way, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has an intentionally confusing ending, but I think I may have figured it out. Or at least kind of figured it out. Again, this is my interpretation. Let me know if you agree, if you think I'm a fucking idiot, or if I'm onto something, but still a little off. The multiverse stuff is the biggest talking point of Remake and Rebirth, but I feel like it's going to be a bit of a red herring in the end. I'll try and keep everything as streamlined as possible, but I think a lot of what we're shown over the game's final hours is nothing but smoke and mirrors. I think people are looking way too hard into it and not seeing the forest for the trees. I believe the writers are intentionally trying to confuse players, and it's working. The first thing we need to focus on is what Sephiroth tells Cloud in their weird little multiverse trip. In Rebirth, we probably see 7 or 8 different timelines, but Sephiroth gives a big exposition dump and tells the player that there are essentially limitless worlds constantly being formed and erased now that fate has been broken. I'm sure you've seen this clip replayed in dozens of videos by this point, and it's always followed up with why this is important. I think everyone is on the wrong side and not realizing how unimportant these different timelines are. Sephiroth is straight up telling us that most of what's going on in these alternate timelines doesn't really matter until everything starts to reunite back into the lifestream, into the homecoming that he wants before his full-on reunion. While everyone is trying to look for every little detail and any sign of stamp, we're missing the most obvious clues. That Rebirth is kind of flat out telling us that a lot of what we're being shown doesn't matter. It's worlds being born and worlds dying over and over again without any significant changes being made. Let's look at the Zack and Biggs side of the story for some evidence as to why I think none of it has really affected the narrative yet. Somehow, Biggs from the remake timeline gets sent to the timeline where Zack survived, but he still has all of his original memories. By the time the two meet up in the reactor, they're both now in a new timeline, as shown by the pug rather than the terrier that started it all. How's this end? Biggs gets shot and killed by Shinra troopers, just like he was supposed to in the original timeline. This version of Zack jumps down into the empty reactor to avoid the Shinra military, and is never seen again, so we have to assume he's been killed too. While we do see a quick flash as he jumps, there is no rainbow aura, and we know the game makes using this as a priority. What about the path where he goes to Shinra HQ to try and save Cloud? Once again, he's attacked by Shinra troopers and never seen again, assumed to be dead. This scene ends the same way too. No rainbow aura, but instead with the white flash. That white flash almost always means the lifestream, not a timeline jump. Somehow this version of Zack also gets a new motorcycle between scenes. When he chooses the Cloud path, he's got more of a dirt bike, but when we see him at Shinra headquarters, he's got the big dual-wheel Hardy Daytona. Is this a continuity error, or did Zack change bikes off screen? Is this another timeline split inside of a timeline split? None of it matters because we have to now assume that these timelines are doomed, or at least these versions of Zack are now dead since we never see them again. None of what I just talked about matters because the Zack we see for the rest of the game is the Zack that is sitting at Aerith's church, still trying to decide what to do. This is the Zack that Sephiroth banishes and sends into the void and later fights with Cloud. The other Zacks and Biggs? Just another spoke on the wheel of those ever beginning and ending timelines. Now, I don't want people to misinterpret what I just talked about. When I say it doesn't matter, my intention isn't to shit on the game or Zack's character. I mean it in the most literal form. I just think that so far his story has been to show us that a lot of the multiverse stuff doesn't affect the bigger picture of the narrative. Just like Sephiroth says, worlds come and go, and there's no reason to mourn them. Zack and Big's purpose was to introduce the idea of the multiverse before we get the big ending with Cloud, Aerith, and Sephiroth. We're led to believe that the Sephiroth who just made Zack no-clip into the backrooms is also the same Sephiroth that finds Aerith in her church. In that case, shouldn't Cloud and Aerith have seen Zack sitting on the stairs, or he noticed that there were still people inside the church? Doesn't matter, because these are just different timelines where similar events happen. This isn't the only timeline where Sephiroth goes into the church to find Aerith, and whether Zack is there or not, it doesn't really make a difference right now. The game is literally showing us the majority of the multiverses don't matter. They're only there to be reabsorbed by the lifestream. We don't know the rules yet. There are clearly more than one version of our main characters. We have the normal main party alive in their timeline, while Zack has most of them dead, Cloud is a vegetable, and Aerith in a coma. Essentially, there are countless different versions of these characters in countless different scenarios. This is why multiverses kinda suck. Currently, Zack is in a new timeline after Aerith saves him from the one that's about to be destroyed by a meteor. Are there two Zacks in this timeline now? Did his soul just pop into an already existing Zack? Did this have to be a timeline where Zack still died and now he's allowed to be here since there can't be two at the same time? We don't know, and there's no way to know. We can have all the theories and look into every little detail that we want, but I'm pretty confident in saying the developers have purposely given us an ending to the game that we aren't supposed to piece together yet. I'm sure this all sounds like a pretty big cop-out in what's supposed to be a plot analysis video, but that's my analysis of it. I think we aren't supposed to fully understand what's going on with everything yet. I think Zack's scenes serve three purposes. 1, to introduce the player to the multiverse theory. 2, to show the player that memories can transfer from timeline to timeline. And 3, that history is most likely going to repeat itself anyway. We already know there are multiverses, and we already know that characters have kept memories through different timelines. So let's focus on that third idea now. My best guess is that even though fate has technically been broken, we're going to get a narrative of history repeating itself and you can't hide from your destiny. Biggs goes to a new timeline and is still shot and killed by Shinra troops. Zack runs into platoons twice and is presumed dead as a result each time. And Sephiroth is also still hunting down Aerith. Biggs, Zack, and Aerith are still meeting their same fates, just in different scenarios. This is completely speculation, but I think that's why we never see different versions of our characters like Tifa, Barret, and the rest throughout the timelines. They either beat Shinra and Sephiroth, or they die. There's no in-between for them, which is why the only other versions we do see, they're assumed to be dead as well. How we get from the opening bombing mission to the outskirts of Midgar was a different, longer path, but it still follows the major plot points of the original game. Even with Fate Broken and the supposed Boundless Freedom remake's ending talks about, how we got from Calm to Aerith's death was a different, longer path, but it still follows most of the original game's plot points. I think the third game is going to be no different. More elements will have been added, and it'll be a much bigger pathway to it, but it's still going to be essentially the same outcome as the PS1 game. Cloud's going to give away the black materia, and Meteor will still be summoned. Cloud's brain will break afterwards, and it will be fixed by Tifa, who will likely have a little more help this time around. Weapons will be awakened by the planet, we'll get the High Wind in the submarine, we'll return to Midgar to take down the Shinra, and then we'll go to the Northern Crater for the final fight with Sephiroth. Just like Remake and Rebirth, a ton of new elements will be added to the story, and some events will play out differently, but in the end, all the major plot points will be hit. Everyone is trying so hard to look for answers that we aren't noticing, in the grand scheme of things, how little the multiverse stuff has actually affected the foundation of the story so far. Well, there are two things being set up as possible changes. So let's get into the meat of the main ending with Cloud, Sephiroth, and Aerith. Let's focus on Aerith's death and Cloud's mental state. I'll cover them both together since they are attached at the hip this time around. First and foremost, I think Aerith is currently dead. Like, very dead. I also think that the Aerith we see around the Tiny Bronco isn't Aerith from the Lifestream or another timeline. It's a Jenova illusion from Cloud's shattered mental state. But not a Jenova that's being controlled by Sephiroth. I'll explain what I mean with that a little later when we get to those scenes. But I do believe that the Aerith we see in the final Sephiroth fight is some form of Aerith being alive in a more metaphysical body, similar to what Sephiroth does. Because of this theory, I also think that right in the beginning of the final fight, Sephiroth isn't talking to Cloud when he says, "I must admit, I underestimated you," and this is directed towards the abilities that Aerith now has. Let's unpack everything and start from the beginning of a lengthy end section. Popping in real quick while I'm doing the video edit, this theory is 100% predicated on the opinion that there's more going on than just Aerith is dead and Cloud can't handle it mentally. If I'm wrong and it really is that simple, then I think Rebirth completely botched this ending sequence and made it way too confusing for absolutely no reason. But I'm assuming there is more going on than just Sephiroth killed Aerith and Cloud went nuts. So just keep that in mind for this next big section. Cloud manages to break free of the Whisper's grasp on him and tries to deflect Sephiroth's killing blow. Right before he swings, you can see the Lifestream surround Cloud's sword, and during the struggle, there is the rainbow effect subtly visible around both characters as their swords clash. In our current timeline, it appears that Cloud actually saves Aerith. He clearly deflects the attack, pushes Sephiroth back, and his sword lands upright in the ground. This is very short-lived though, as we start getting Jenova blips, and we see that everything really played out just like the original game. Sephiroth has delivered a fatal wound, and Aerith slumps forward as the white materia then falls from her ribbon. After this, we get a ton of the Jenova flashes, and we see different shots of Aerith and Cloud. In some she's alive, and in others she's dying and Cloud is weeping over her. The party returns, and they clearly see Aerith is dead, while Cloud now doesn't, and then the Jenova fight ensues. But it should be noted that Tifa also seems to see two different versions of these events as well, even if it's only for a second. So there's a lot of shit going on here. From this scene, there are a ton of different viewpoints online, namely whether Cloud is crazy, is Aerith really dead, and whether timelines have split. I don't think it's one simple answer, and actually I think everyone is kind of right. I think it's a combination of all three ideas. Let's start from the beginning of this. To give an example that everyone should be familiar with, I think this follows the same idea as the Doctor Strange Time Stone scene from Infinity War, where he says that Thanos wins millions of outcomes except for one, where everything needs to play out perfectly in order for the Avengers to win. In the Final Fantasy VII version, Aerith plays the part of both Tony Stark and Doctor Strange. Between the multiverse date her and Cloud go on and their meeting in the forest, Aerith clearly knows her time has run out. She knows that the best outcome for victory is that she needs to die here and join the lifestream. She now knows what it's going to take to try and find that one outcome where Sephiroth doesn't win. With that said, I do think that the first scene of Cloud saving Aerith and deflecting the attack actually happened, which will also be very important as to why Cloud's brain is so much worse off now than it was in the original. Trying to revive Aerith was one of gaming's biggest what-ifs, and something that millions of fans have been craving for almost 3 decades now. However, I'm gonna be that guy, and I'm going to trigger a lot of Aerith fans here. There is a lot of evidence in the PS1 game that Aerith being alive is a bad outcome for the planet. In the original PS1 ending, Holy by itself wasn't strong enough to stop Meteor or Sephiroth. It wasn't even really close. The real physical body of Sephiroth in the Northern Crater was holding back Holy by himself, meaning that Aerith's prayer was in vain as long as Sephiroth was alive. After the final battles and Sephiroth is killed, Cloud even says there's nothing more that they can do other than to accept that they did their best and to go home proud. Sephiroth is dead and they just have to wait and hope that Holy can stop Meteor. But it doesn't. It's already too late and too close to the planet to be stopped. The ending cutscene shows and tells us that Meteor is overpowering Holy. Despite beating Sephiroth, they still lost. It's only when the power of the lifestream joins the struggle that Meteor is stopped. And what's the final shot of the game before the credits roll? A vision of Aerith in the glow of the lifestream that mimics the first scene from the game, implying that without her help from within the lifestream, Meteor still would have destroyed the planet whether Sephiroth was there not to reap the benefits. It's entirely possible the party can still defeat Sephiroth in a timeline where Aerith is alive, but that doesn't matter if Cloud is still under Jenova's control and Meteor is still summoned. In order to stop Meteor from destroying the planet, Aerith needs to be in the lifestream. Cloud saving Aerith is actually bad news for the planet. Whether Aerith needed to die or not has been a big debate since the release of the original game. I do not think that Aerith had to die in order to cast Holy, but I do think that she wouldn't have been able to control the lifestream had she already not been a part of it. I was also never under the impression that PS1 Aerith planned on dying. I don't think original Aerith knew that Sephiroth was going to kill her when she went off on her own. But Rebirth Aerith is not too subtle about knowing it needs to be done. In the original, Aerith being dead and able to use the lifestream was really more of a happy accident. By the time Sephiroth was defeated, it was already too late for Holy to counteract Meteor. Had Aerith been alive, Meteor then takes over Holy and the planet is destroyed. But because Aerith was in the lifestream, she could use that as a last-ditch effort to aid Holy, and it actually works. So now, Rebirth Aerith, who has that prior knowledge, knows that Holy isn't a guaranteed victory over Meteor. This is why she's pretty open about knowing her fate. In case Holy doesn't work again, she needs to be in the lifestream to use the power of both against Meteor. Which brings me to my theory, what all the multiverse stuff has been building to at this point in the narrative. I think that initially, Cloud did really save Aerith, but she now knows that this isn't the best course of action. I believe that Aerith purposely pulls herself, Cloud, and Sephiroth into the other timeline that's created, the timeline where she dies. I think that the main narrative is no longer taking place in the current, or Beagle Stamp timeline. Technically, the Beagle timeline that we've been playing is now a timeline where Aerith survives Sephiroth's attack. But after everything I just talked about, that also means that the Beagle timeline is now marked for death, since Aerith won't be in the lifestream to stop Meteor. Ironically enough, when Cloud saved Aerith, he unintentionally dooms the main remake timeline. Let's look at some more evidence, namely the rainbow visual effect that happens throughout these scenes. Before Sephiroth appears, there is no rainbow effect in the background. As Cloud deflects his sword, that rainbow effect appears for the first time, signaling that there has been a split in the timelines. Again, Cloud clearly deflects the attack, so what we are seeing shouldn't have moved to a different timeline. The new timeline split would be where Aerith is dead and Cloud failed to save her. But after the Jenova blip, we see Sephiroth smiling as he pulls a bloody sword from Aerith's back, as Cloud looks on in confusion. I think Aerith removes the three of them from the main timeline at this moment, and sends them into the opposite side of the split that Cloud just created. Because of Aerith, they are now in the opposite timeline where Cloud failed. When we see Sephiroth pull at the Masamune, the rainbow effect in the background is clearly gone after the blip. It's the only scene where this is not present, and comes right back in afterwards. Why is that, you ask? It's not directly first person, but we're seeing things through his perspective, and he doesn't know what Aerith just did, which is why there isn't a rainbow timeline aura. But when the focus goes from Sephiroth back to Cloud noticing Aerith has been stabbed, that rainbow aura has returned. I could be grasping at straws here with this next part, but I also think that Sephiroth's reaction is a little telling. In the original, he doesn't laugh after he kills Aerith, he just starts to ramble on about her returning to the lifestream while Cloud is in disbelief. In Rebirth, his reaction is a little weird. He goes from an evil belly laugh to then mocking Cloud in his usual monotone voice. There's a little pause in between, almost like he needs to compose himself again for a second. But noticeably, that aura is now surrounding all three of them again. I don't think Sephiroth is laughing because he just killed Aerith. I think he's laughing because he just realized that Aerith purposely sacrificed herself, and he doesn't fully understand why yet. He just knows that he got what he wanted, and not really how it happened. After his quick realization that she timeline swapped them, he goes back to his plan and starts mocking Cloud. Now, here's something that I honestly have no clue about, but I'll give you my best guess. Barret is the first one to arrive, and the camera cuts to his direct first-person line of sight. It's not as visible as some of the other cutscenes, but you can still tell that Barret sees Aerith is bleeding out. It's a little tougher to tell, but there is red under her, and the smear on her arm is there as well. Barret and the rest of the party see Aerith as dead, except for Cloud and Tifa. Tifa experiences what's usually seen as the Cloud Jenova blip when she first sees Aerith. As opposed to Barret seeing Aerith dead the whole time, Tifa sees the same flashes that Cloud does. The main difference being that, obviously, Tifa's flash ends with Aerith covered in blood, where Cloud still sees her as being okay. This isn't the first time that Tifa has one of these moments either. When we first return to the Nibelheim reactor, Tifa starts to have a panic attack when Kurisaki's body reminds her of finding her father after he was killed by Sephiroth. In that scene, the roles are reversed. Tifa has the mental breakdown flash and starts to freak out, only to have Cloud comfort her and snap her back to reality. Because we always associated these flashes to Cloud and his broken memories, they got lumped in as Jenova blips from the original game. I guess it turns out these are just meant more as mental hiccups in general than something that should be associated directly with Jenova cells. While Tifa does get exposed to quite a bit of Mako in the lifestream earlier in the game, I don't think that plays any part here. My best guess is that they use this blip to signal a mental issue in general. Tifa can't catch much of a break in Rebirth, and I think her seeing Aerith in such a bad state was her having a similar panic attack situation as earlier in the game. At first, she just refused to believe what she was seeing, but because her brain hasn't been experimented on like Cloud's, the trauma doesn't affect her the same way, and she sees reality where Cloud sees what he thinks is reality. But let's get back on topic. The circular rainbow effect that surrounds Cloud, Aerith, and Sephiroth in these scenes also looks pretty damn similar to the effect that we see when Aerith pushes Cloud back into another timeline during their multiverse date. We now know that Aerith has some form of control over the timelines, and I think she purposely switched them into another timeline where Cloud's attempt fails and she was killed by Sephiroth. And what are her last words to Cloud on that date?
This isn't about me, though. It's about saving the world. And you.
She knows what she has to do for the greater good, and she knows how much this new wrinkle in time is going to affect Cloud. This is why Cloud's mental state is so much worse at the end of Rebirth than it is in the original PS1 version. In that game, Cloud accepts her death, accepts that he doesn't know what's going on in his head, and even asks the party to stick with him and stop him from doing something terrible that's out of his control. On the PS1, Cloud is still kind of Cloud after Aerith dies, or at least the Jenova version of him that he still believes to be himself. At the end of Rebirth, Cloud's in much worse shape. Ironically, he isn't completely crazy like people think. If my theory is true, then he doesn't just make up that he saved Aerith. He knows that he did. But Cloud doesn't know that Aerith switched the timelines around. We've seen characters who jump timelines keep memories that aren't technically true anymore. This is why I say that most of the Biggs and Zack stuff wasn't really to affect the narrative. Aerith pulled Cloud from one timeline to another, and unfortunately, he kept the memory of saving her from Sephiroth. Cloud's brain, which is still currently pretty messed up from the Hojo experiments, is now trying to piece together experiencing two very different realities. In the original game, Cloud was never intentionally an unreliable narrator. The combination of Hojo's experiments and Mako poisoning completely deep fries his brain. That then allowed the Jenova cells to mix up his memories of Zack and Tifa to form what he truly believed to be his reality. I think it's the same exact idea surrounding Aerith's death. Cloud knows he really saved her, so his already damaged brain can't comprehend what's going on, and that is what in turn makes him seem crazy. It's not as simple as she died and Cloud can't accept it, it's the shock of her death after he knows for a fact that he saved her, and that pushes him over the edge. He isn't actively trying to make up a new reality where she's alive. It's the same thought process as the beginning of the PS1 game, except it's happening again and in an even more traumatic way. We always associate Jenova's illusions and mimic abilities with Sephiroth controlling them, but that's not always the case. After seeing Tifa in Midgar, the Jenova cells mix with his true memories of her to snap Cloud out of his Mako poisoning. Jenova then uses his memories of Zack to fill in those blanks and create this false narrative of his life. This all had nothing to do with Sephiroth. It was a combination of Jenova's inherent powers, the Mako poisoning, and Cloud's own insecurities. After the experiments, Cloud now physically fit the bill of someone in Soldier 2, so he really had no reason to question these false memories that Jenova put in his head. After saving Aerith, but somehow also seeing her die, the Jenova cells do the same thing again. They kick in and mix with Cloud's memories of her being alive, making Cloud now fully believe another false narrative. Only this time, it's not just about Cloud. His brain is literally showing him things that aren't really there. I don't think Sephiroth has anything to do with Cloud wrongly seeing Aerith alive, just like he had nothing to do with Jenova blending Cloud's memories of Tifa and Zack together. I think this is another reason why Aerith is so somber towards the end of her scenes. Besides obviously knowing that she's going to die, she knows that her swapping timelines is really going to mess with Cloud's brain. She clearly doesn't want to die or to hurt Cloud, but she knows that she has to do both of those things to try and beat Sephiroth later down the line. I think this is why she tries to thank Cloud in the beginning of the Sephiroth fight too. This is the exact scenario that Cloud daydreamed of when he left to try and join Soldier, to be a hero and save the people he cares about if they're in danger. Cloud did save Aerith, and she had to take that victory away from him. To wrap all these ridiculous theories up, here's one last bit of evidence I have. It's a scene of Aerith saying that she'll be counting on her future self for one specific moment, and telling Cloud that he'll meet this future Aerith as well.
What I'm trying to say is, worry about the future when it comes. You'll know what to do. And whatever you decide, I'm with you.
I appreciate it. Shall we? No need to worry about the future till it comes. Not until the moment arrives. And when it does, I'll be counting on you.
Good.
Not you. That was to her, my future self. Can't say when you'll meet, but trust me, you'll love her. Just you wait.
Let's move on to that final fight now. As I said in the beginning, I think all of this added up together is why Sephiroth is talking to Aerith and not Cloud when he says, "I underestimated you." He didn't anticipate that she could learn to manipulate her own memories and to manipulate timelines the same way that he has. I also think that the Edge of Creation level is really where Sephiroth has been hiding and staying alive in the livestream after his physical death at the end of the PlayStation 1 game. This is why it seems to get purified and turned back into the white glow of the livestream when Aerith arrives at the last battle. This isn't just her finding Sephiroth's hiding spot, this is her getting a jump on his Geostigma plan in Advent Children and cleansing the corrupted livestream years before he would even have a chance to spread it. She knew what she was doing the entire time and managed to outsmart Sephiroth. This next part might seem like complete fanfiction, but I do think there is a decent chance it will come true in Part 3. I get the feeling that the Aerith we see in the final boss fight isn't the same Aerith we've been playing as during Remake and Rebirth. This could potentially be the Aerith from the original timeline. That this is the same Aerith we played as back in 1997. Remake Sephiroth is the same person that Cloud already beat 3 times in the original story. Why can't this be the same Aerith that we see on the PS1 and in Advent Children? Aerith and Sephiroth are basically playing tug of war with the livestream in the post-PlayStation 1 game narrative, so it kinda makes sense for the real Aerith to be the one to show up in this fight too. I could be taking her words too literally, but her saying she saw what Cloud did for her would make a lot of sense too. Technically, it was the remake version of Aerith that lived and experienced it, but the original game Aerith, still watching on from in the livestream, visibly saw what Cloud did. This would also make the scene of them standing back to back holding hands be more than just an Easter egg. It's Aerith reliving a moment the two already shared from the future in Advent Children before she goes back into the livestream again. I do think this plot twist would kinda split the fan base, but I do also think there's probably a 50-50 shot that this could really be the Aerith from the original game showing up after the Aerith from Remake was killed. When Cloud approaches Aerith after the fight, this is the only scene I'm not too confident in explaining though. The thing that keeps throwing me off is the timeline split effect being in the background again. Every other time we see this visual effect, it has a purpose. Here, I think it's really just in Cloud's head. Right now, Cloud can't decipher what's real and what's not, and I feel like he's also imagining the aura of the timeline split too. While we don't see it happen, this is very likely the scene where Cloud picks her up and lowers her body into the lake. But with his current mental state and Genova cells, he remembers a better scenario. A scenario where he saved her and she's alive, which pushes out the memory of her burial. When we get the scenes of Tifa fixing his brain in Part 3, I think it'll show us that he really did pick her up and take her to the lake. Rather than just focusing on the soldier stuff and him not being in the Nibelheim photo, Aerith's makeshift funeral will also be a big reason for forcing Cloud to fully come to terms with his memories. But the way Cloud currently remembers it, it's just that Aerith never died. After all, her death can't be reality, he knows he saved her. It's also pretty telling how when Cloud walks up to her, the rest of the group disappears when they are clearly all around beforehand. If this vision we're seeing was real, rainbow aura and all, Cloud would basically have stepped on Tifa to get to Aerith's body. We know Aerith isn't really alive here, but I also think that the timeline split aura here is in Cloud's head too. While the end result of Aerith dying and the party heading north is the same as the original, what's going on with Cloud in that game is very, very different. We see characters react to Aerith's death before her burial, but not after. Once her body falls to the bottom of the lake, the next scene is Cloud giving his speech and admitting he doesn't really know what's going on in his head. In Rebirth, Cloud is already on the verge of his mental collapse. This is a pretty sad scene, but it's one that depicts the characters' reactions really well. Vincent, Cait, Sith, and Sid are off on their own because they kinda get lumped together in this game. Vincent and Sid aren't really party members yet, so they stick to the side, and Cait Sith joins them there because even though he helped at the Temple of the Ancients, he's still not really on great terms with everyone again. Barret is trying to hide his emotions and deal with the situation alone, like he tends to do. Yuffie and Nanaki are trying to comfort themselves and not impose on Cloud and Tifa, who sit closest to the lake. I feel like Remake, and especially Rebirth, have clearly leaned into the relationship of Cloud and Tifa, so going crazy or not, it makes sense that he'd still choose to be closest to her after this event. These two games also have purposely played up the friendship between Tifa and Aerith as well, as Nojima has admitted that the two didn't really feel like friends in the original. This ending is especially hard on Tifa. She loses Aerith, and she has to watch Cloud's mental state completely fall apart. Eventually, Barret tells Cloud it's time to get moving, which gets a very blunt response from Cloud and a very noticeable worried sigh from Tifa. Cloud has a Genova blip about Aerith's death, only to turn around and see her sitting right next to him. Cloud smiles and stares to his left, while Barret just puts his head down and walks away. Everyone else clears out, and Tifa is the last to leave. After Cloud tells her it's time to go, Tifa then watches Cloud smile and look at no one as he walks off. There are a few scenes in between, but I'll get to those in a minute. Let's finish up with this section with Cloud's broken head and Aerith. As I already said, I do not believe this is Aerith in any true shape or form. I think this version of Aerith is 100% in Cloud's head, as a mixture of everything that's wrong with his mental state, mixing with Genova's mimic abilities. Side note, there's a weirdly timed line from Sid where he asks, what did Aerith even do anyway? I know this means, what was she praying for, but after her death, I laughed at it because it kinda came off as him being like, why is everyone still so sad? What did this bitch even bring to the table? Just thought it was a weird line that didn't need to be there. Anyway, the one scene that seems to debunk my whole theory is that Nanaki senses Aerith when she walks past him. I think this is just a little bit of deception to throw off the player. Or it could easily be that he does kinda sense something is off. While he's not a Cetra, he's definitely closer to the livestream and all that than the rest of the party members. Even if she's a Genova illusion from Cloud's head, there's a good chance Nanaki could get a whiff of that where everyone else would be none the wiser. But we also get a weird scene of Cloud with the black materia and it literally infusing into the Buster Sword. I could easily be forgetting something, but I don't think materia has ever been shown to do that, and it's the game's way of telling us, hey, Cloud has this, but we need to keep it a secret, so it just does this now, that just happens. They could easily be doing the same thing with Nanaki and Aerith, and it's just there to throw us off. I do believe that the rift in the sky is real though, however, I don't buy into the whole Cloud being stuck between realities idea. As the new trilogy goes on, the Lifestream, the Whispers, and Genova are all kind of turning into Deus Ex Machinas that seem to keep getting more and more new abilities as the plot demands it. I do think this timeline has been marked for death, but it's not quite solidified yet. Like Sephiroth says, some still endure where others quickly fade away. Like, it's not looking too good right now, but it's not entirely hopeless either. I believe only Cloud can currently see it due to his connection with Sephiroth, and I do think the rest of the party will eventually see it in the third game, most likely after Cloud's sanity breaks and a meteor is summoned. I think it's done on purpose too. As Cloud is talking to an illusion of Aerith, the thing that he points out as being an illusion is actually there. The last part is pretty sad too. As the attention focuses back to Tifa and Barret, everyone else runs off, but Barret and Tifa know something is not right with Cloud. Well, even more not right than usual. Barret gives a glance back to Tifa, sighs, and says he trusts Cloud, but it's really out of knowing they don't have much of a choice. Barret clearly has no confidence at all in Cloud right now. After Cloud says he can handle it, Barret looks back to Tifa again, who still looks mortified by everything that's happened. When you watch these two scenes again, it really makes you feel even worse for Tifa. This isn't Barret just thinking, hey, Tifa, he's not okay. It's Barret looking to Tifa for help and getting none. Those looks and sighs aren't directed at just Cloud. He's thinking, hey, Tifa, this is usually where you step in. Are you gonna fucking say anything to him right now? But she doesn't. She just stays silent and gets on the plane. We get one last conversation with Cloud and Aerith, and it's really just an awkward sounding back and forth. Even the first time I saw this, it just felt off. I think the writers chose these lines very specifically though. The whole, you gonna be okay getting back and it being like a second home, is to throw players off in that Cloud really means back to the livestream. Really, these are lines from Remake. Cloud's just piecing together old conversations.
You gonna be okay getting home?
And if I said I wasn't?
You gonna be okay getting back?
And if I said I wasn't?
But the most telling thing that something is off is with Aerith's response to Cloud saying he'll stop Sephiroth. She excitedly says, "You promise?" as Cloud leaves on the tiny Bronco. Aerith has repeatedly told Cloud to take care of himself, and their last real conversation, she flat out tells him to stay away from Sephiroth. So why would she make him promise this? Well, one of Cloud's genuine memories is how Tifa made him promise to save her if she's ever in trouble. I don't think it's a coincidence that Cloud's projection of Aerith also makes him promise to save the day. Jenova is mixing up his memories of Aerith with what's already in his head, that he's going to be the hero and the girl he cares about makes him promise to do this. Jenova is just using his real memories with Tifa to project onto an imaginary Aerith. The real Aerith would never support Cloud to currently seek out another encounter with Sephiroth. This also ties into him not understanding that going north is exactly what Sephiroth wants. It's Cloud being drawn to the reunion. So that's my long, over-explained take on the ending. I know all that probably sounds ridiculous, but I think there is plenty of evidence to support my stance, even if I'm completely wrong. But I fully acknowledge that this could still be as cut and dry as it may appear, that Sephiroth killed Aerith right off the bat, and Cloud went insane. But that just makes everything these two games have shown us with the multiverses not really matter in such a simplified conclusion. It would be hours of wasted build-up and screen time if there weren't any connections other than Zack fighting alongside Cloud for 5 minutes. If there's no connection and they just added a bunch of nonsense for no reason, that's just flat out bad storytelling, and the multiverse stuff never should have been added to the narrative in the first place. But I do think that they have something bigger in store for Part 3, and we're going to be waiting a few years to find out whatever that is. While that covers the ending as it pertains to the main game, there are still a few subplots to look over. Let's start with Rufus and the Wutai plot. Since it takes me forever to make these, I'm sure everyone will have long figured out that Rufus is Viceroy Saruf. Expanding on the Wutai War in Part 3 could be a pretty interesting idea, and further shows how Rufus has his hand in everything. For anyone unfamiliar with the lore in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, Rufus is also the main benefactor of Avalanche before his father is killed. He's very likely the one behind the assassination attempt on President Shinra that's mentioned at the start of Remake 2. This shows us that Rufus is no stranger to working as somewhat of a double agent. He gets to try and take power away from his father, while also knowing of Avalanche's moves whenever he takes over as president. He's basically working the same angle with Wutai, promoting war for all its benefits, while managing to be the man on the inside controlling both parties. That's kinda cool, and expands upon the lore of how cutthroat and power-hungry Rufus is. I'm not huge on the whole Glenn Lodbrok thing, though.
And as for you, I don't know you, but I'm sure you're a jerk.
When it's revealed that Glenn's just a Sephiroth clone, it feels too out of place to me. I get it, Jenova has all the mimicry abilities, and Sephiroth keeping Shinra busy instead of tailing him makes sense, but this is still Jenova and Sephiroth. Does giving speeches in a dimly lit basement like an Al-Qaeda member in hiding really seem like Sephiroth's style? Not at fucking all. Rufus playing both sides fits his character perfectly. For Sephiroth, this just seems extremely out of character. Now that we know what his plan was, I hope Part 3 leaves Sephiroth out of this plotline, and it just goes on with Shinra and Wutai. There is one potentially major element of Rufus' character that didn't get expanded upon in Rebirth, though. This is very likely nothing of note, but it may turn into something. Before the release of Remake, I remember looking to see if they changed any characters' ages. For example, while the drinking age in Japan is 20, it's 21 in America, and Tifa is a 20-year-old bar owner. It looked like everyone was kept at the same ages, though, except for Rufus Shinra. He was aged up from 25 in the original to 30 in the remake. Why is this potentially important? He would have been born right around the same time that all the Jenova experiments were taking place. Give or take a little wiggle room, he'd be right about the same age as Sephiroth, Angeal, Genesis, and all the initial experiments with children in Jenova. At this point, I don't think it's going to amount to anything other than a weird retcon that made him older, but it's something to maybe look out for in Part 3. I think this scene with Rufus and Sephiroth is very purposely placed though. It's not just a break to show the passage of time with the main party, I think it's there as a not too subtle reminder of Jenova's mimicry abilities before showing Cloud talking to a dead aerith. I do love how they show Rufus lose his composure over this reveal though. Rufus is an absolute control freak and someone who prides himself on always having the upper hand. To see that frustration come out in full force is a new angle on the character, and I am interested to see how he handles the Wutai situation now. We also get a quick scene of the weapons again. These two weapons are new to the game as opposed to the kaiju-sized 5 that we see in the original. I think Rebirth is using these two as lookouts or sentries of sorts, that they keep tabs on the status of the planet and alert the lifestream to any significant dangers. Well, Sephiroth, Shinra, multiple timelines, and whatever the hell the Whispers are doing, yeah, those are all problems for the planet. It looks like they used the materia that's attached to their stomachs, and I would assume that materia just gave the lifestream a heads up to prepare the real weapons we see in the original. I don't think that the weapons will be included in any of the Doomed timeline stuff either. The weapons are creations of the planet, and their only purpose is to bring back stability and eliminate any threats to the existence of the planet. On the surface, that seems like a good thing for our group since they want to save the planet too. Only issue is that these weapons seem to view humanity in general as a threat, so they attack indiscriminately. They won't be helping out our party like the whale-shaped weapons helped Tifa. When Diamond, Ruby, Emerald, Sapphire, and Ultimate weapons are unleashed, all of humanity is fair game in their eyes. Lastly, I do want to circle back to the Zack stuff again, since it's such a big dividing line in the fanbase. Not so much that Zack as a character is, but the whole multiverse stuff that's going on around him. I think it's getting blown out of proportion, and I was definitely guilty of this at times too. At first I had a much bigger section dedicated to this, and it was not very positive. As I stressed in the intro, I'm not big on multiverses because of how easily they can negate plot points and pull new rules out of their ass at will. If you really think about it, Zack and the multiverse really haven't affected the main plot. The multiverse is a new big plot point in itself, but Zack himself hasn't really done anything to change the events of the game. His role has been to ease the player into those new multiverse plotlines, to give us bits and pieces of what's going on before all the craziness of the ending and what's possibly to come in Part 3. For now, I'm going to take the Zack stuff at face value, see it for what it is, and hope that they have something cool planned for him in Part 3. My original script on this was pretty long, and I think it was mostly projecting my fears of what might happen into what already has. I was assuming that they have no rules set in place, that they were just going to constantly use the MacGuffin of because time travel to do whatever they want. Them fulfilling the internet joke of Zack just walking out of a portal to randomly help Cloud fight Sephiroth didn't really help my initial stance either.
Oh wait, you serious? Let me laugh even harder.
But the more I thought about the main ending surrounding Cloud and Aerith, the more I realized I was just being dramatic about the Zack stuff. He really hasn't done anything yet, so I feel like criticizing what could happen isn't fair. We can definitely criticize how they wrote everything to be intentionally confusing, and how the side story of a multiversal Zack trying to return to the main timeline does feel a little like fanfiction, but until I get to see more of what Zack's real role in the narrative is, again, I'm going to take it at face value. At this point, we have to assume that Broken Head Cloud doesn't even remember fighting with him. Until we get to see what they have planned for Zack in Part 3, there really isn't a whole lot to report on when it comes to his side of the story. But I also might be a little biased here. I was never a huge fan of Zack, and didn't think his character really needed to be expanded upon. But I will say, I think Rebirth Zack is the best portrayal of him so far. He's still a middle-of-the-pack character for me, but I did like this version more than what I've seen in the past. I knew the ending was going to be the biggest portion of this video, but there is still a lot to unpack in Rebirth, and I'll kind of just throw out ideas that I want to talk about. First off, this isn't so much anything to do with the narrative, but it's something that I was just thrilled with in general. Rebirth did a fantastic job of capturing the feeling of the original Final Fantasy VII. Because Cloud got turned into the mopey, depressed character in a lot of the compilation, and even things like Dissidia and Kingdom Hearts, people tend to forget just how goofy the original game was. Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation 1 has a very specific charm to it that I always thought would be damn near impossible to replicate in modern times. The tone slingshots between serious and lighthearted constantly. Humor is a very regular tool the game uses to hide behind its, at times, very mature content, some of which is also very not PC by today's standards. Besides just being a sign of the times, this was so much easier to pull off in 1997 because characters were still misshapen polygons, and no one really took video games seriously unless the topic was realistic violent content. That lighthearted tone they used to avoid the mature rating also allowed them to turn some pretty adult themes into goofy scenarios, like the way Cid treats Shara and really kind of everyone, the Honeybee Inn basically being a brothel, and making us forget that Don Corneo is actually a feared mobster and human sex trafficker. Hell, Tifa of all characters even calls Barrett this word that YouTube doesn't like anymore, which I thought was kind of funny because the PS4 remaster censors a lot more dialogue than the original game does, but they forgot about that exchange. Remake did an okay job of recapturing the same silliness and charm of the original, but Rebirth absolutely nailed it. There were more than a few times that this game had me genuinely laughing to myself. There's the Bald Men Club and Cloud going from stage fright to Tifa and Aerith needing to pull him away from his speech, Nanaki at the end of the Queen's Blood tournament, Cloud getting caught staring at Tifa's chest, and before that being afraid to do chest compressions on Yuffie, Barrett making an appearance as the evil Dragon King from the Gold Saucer play. Those are some of the big ones that everyone got a kick out of, but Rebirth has a ton of little missable moments too. Things like Elena being upset and telling us to go away because she's too busy being sad made me laugh more than it should have, and I loved the little Barrett drawings that Yuffie left behind in Corel. Speaking of those two, there's just little stuff in the background sometimes, like this scene, where Yuffie is messing with Barrett before he shoos her away, and no characters draw attention to it. It's just a silly thing taking place in the background that none of the characters acknowledge, and the majority of players aren't even going to notice. There's other things like Vincent not knowing how to use a modern handheld device because he's been asleep for so long, but later on having no trouble with the old CB radio and the tiny Bronco. Rebirth does an amazing job of knowing when to be serious, but simultaneously not taking itself seriously at all. To me, matching the feeling, the tone, and just the charm of the original 1997 game in 2024, while using modern graphics and realistic characters, is arguably the greatest accomplishment of Rebirth. This won't mean as much to people experiencing the story for the first time, or to younger players who didn't get a chance to play it back in the day, but for old farts like myself who played it as a little kid in the 90s, this was a big deal to me. Not to sound too sappy, but it just made me really happy while I was playing. Besides just being a better game overall, Rebirth captures what the original Final Fantasy was so much better than Remake did. Let's keep the good vibes going and get started with some of the changes they made that I think work really well. I absolutely love that they added in the soldier degradation plot, and that's something that I thought I'd never say. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Crisis Core, so for them to take a major plot element from that game and positively add it into the narrative is pretty impressive. I fully believe that Cloud having cellular degradation is a red herring though. It's there to give the rest of the party a reason to sympathize with Cloud and make excuses for his mental state. In the original, I won't say it's a plot hole, but it's definitely a pretty big plot convenience that everyone knows Cloud's a weirdo, but they never really question it. Barrett will tell Cloud to get his shit together here and there, but for the majority of the game, no one really talks about what's going on with Cloud's erratic behavior. They just kind of accept it because that's what the plot needs. The whole process of Soldier, Genova cells, and Hojo's reunion experiments is a little all over the place though. Anyone who joins Soldier is exposed to high levels of Mako and injected with Genova cells. This is what increases their strength and gives them that weird glow in their eyes. Because of this, Soldier members aren't chosen based off of just their combat abilities, they need to be mentally very tough as well. They need to have the mental capacity to handle what would otherwise result in Mako poisoning and losing your sense of self. I feel like it's implied throughout a lot of the Final Fantasy VII lore that this is the main factor of why Cloud never actually made it into Soldier. There are examples of Cloud being a very capable fighter, but there are equally as many examples of his issues with anxiety and self-worth being what's holding him back. Let's look at Roche for an example. When I first played Remake, I immediately assumed Roche was a first-class soldier, despite still using the sword and uniform of the lower ranks. Even though he's much physically stronger, Roche is only a third-class soldier. He has all the physical skills of a higher class, but he doesn't have the mental state of one. He was skilled enough to get into soldier and had the mental capacity to handle the experiments, but Shinra probably realized pretty quickly that he would never ascend higher than 3rd class because he's too reckless, doesn't always follow orders, and is really just kind of unhinged. Roche loses to Cloud twice in Remake, and then he loses to Cloud for a 3rd time in Junon, and that drives him to willingly let Hojo experiment on him in order to try and finally defeat Cloud. When he loses yet again, his mental state collapses enough that he degrades and turns into just another robed man. Let's look at Zack on the other hand. Because he's so confident in himself and who he is, he's basically able to fully resist any effects that Jenova might have on him, despite also being part of the reunion experiments. Considering the power boost that Roche gains and how quickly he turns, I think he got an even more souped up version of the reunion experiments that Cloud and Zack went through, but that's just speculation on my part. But circling back, what's all this have to do with Cloud and introducing degradation into his narrative? Well, Cloud should have experienced degradation almost immediately just like Roche did, but he doesn't. Oddly enough, Cloud getting Mako poisoning so badly and becoming a blank slate for Jenova to mess with is why Hojo considers him a failed experiment. Cloud going catatonic during these events 5 years ago actually saves him from degradation in the long run. Throughout the compilation of Final Fantasy VII and the new games, we see that degradation is a little bit of a lie from Shinra. When it's introduced in Crisis Core, degradation is really much more of a physical effect than a mental one. I think they say that degradation makes it harder to control your emotions, but it's not something that basically gives you dementia like the party thinks it's doing to Cloud. The mental side of degradation is where the reunion theory comes into play, but Soldier and Jenova experiments aren't created equally. Yes, they all have Mako treatment and Jenova cells, but how these are given and to what outcome is very different on a character-by-character basis. Again, just look at Roche and Zack. Both were given Jenova cells upon joining Soldier, but Zack has no effects of Hojo's experiments after Nibelheim, where Roche's second dose gives him a substantial power-up and makes him fully lose his mind shortly after. Of course, our party doesn't know all this information, though. This is why they fully believe the rumors they've heard about degradation, and thinking that's what's wrong with Cloud. When in reality, Cloud's actually remembering stuff here and there, and the real issues are Mako poisoning, Jenova, and Sephiroth. Degradation being added to this narrative gives the rest of the party a reason to understand Cloud's behavior, where they just kinda thought he was a weirdo in the original. It's such a small but really smart change that fixes what's kind of a big issue with the original's plot. It's something that gives Tifa's character a bit more depth too. While it's completely unintentional, Tifa enables Cloud's problems by not telling him or anyone else that something is really wrong. In Rebirth, we get to see both Aerith and Tifa try to actively help keep Cloud grounded. And with both of them, especially Tifa, we get to see their reactions grow more and more melancholy as they have less and less success reaching through to Cloud. Since we spent a ton of the video talking about the new direction with Aerith, let's focus on Tifa for a little bit here and some of the changes to her story. Unfortunately, it's hard to talk about Tifa in Rebirth without talking about the goddamn love triangle stuff. Instead of being just another internet neckbeard that argues about who Cloud enjoyed holding hands with more, let's try and look at it from an actual narrative perspective. In the original game, Disc 1 definitely pushes Cloud and Aerith more, where Disc 2 focuses on Cloud and Tifa. There's two main reasons for this. The most obvious being that Aerith is a little waterlogged after Disc 1, and pushing her relationship with Cloud before she's killed is a way to have fans more invested and shocked when that happens. The second, and more story-driven answer, is that Cloud and Tifa's character arcs are very intertwined. They're the only two playable characters that share any type of real history together before the main events of the game. You could argue Zack here as well due to the Nibelheim incident, but we're talking about the original game here, and Zack is a pretty minor character in that narrative. Whereas Zack was used as a plot device to fill the gaps needed to make the twists of Cloud's false memories work, Tifa's character is directly involved in most of Cloud's life. Aerith, Tifa, and Cloud are the three main characters of Final Fantasy VII, excluding Sephiroth and Jenova as the main villains. Aerith is probably the most important character in terms of the greater narrative about saving the planet, but Tifa is the most important character in terms of Cloud's personal arc. Aerith supports the bigger picture, Tifa supports the main protagonist. So when you're writing this love triangle into the story, Tifa has an unfair advantage based solely off of how the narrative is pieced together. She's much more important to Cloud personally, because they are two characters that have connecting backstories. If being dead wasn't a big enough hurdle, Aerith also has to get past all the history and shared trauma that Tifa and Cloud have together. Why is all of this important? Because I feel like Rebirth really leans into these aspects of Cloud and Tifa's relationship. Clearly there are feelings between Cloud and Aerith as well, but I just think that Rebirth pushes the Cloud and Tifa narrative more. First things first, you need to ignore the optional stuff like the gold saucer dates. I'm pretty sure that fans care way more about the whole love triangle than the actual writers do, and all the optional stuff is just that. It's fan service. If you do want to focus on the optional stuff, I think Tifa would still get the nod there too though. But again, it's all fan service. If you support Cloud and Aerith, there's plenty there for you to like, and vice versa with Tifa. But between both the story and optional scenes, I feel like there was one big trend. Scenes with Cloud and Aerith usually felt like Aerith was taking the lead, and Cloud's a bit oblivious. Scenes with Cloud and Tifa felt more mutual, or even Cloud being the one to take the initiative sometimes. Both pairings get their shine, but I was definitely under the impression that Rebirth is giving Tifa the nod. When Cloud starts going nuts throughout the game, they make it very clear that Tifa is the one who brings him back to reality. At least until the very end when no one is reaching him. They even give Yuffie a line where she flat out says that she's not worried about Cloud because Tifa will be there to keep him in line, and I talked earlier about Barrett looking to Tifa for help with Cloud in the final scenes of the game. The party fully recognizes that she's the one keeping him grounded. You can argue that if Aerith was never killed, the two end up together, and maybe you'd be right. But she was killed, and it never happened. Aerith has also never been around when Cloud was himself, but what we do know is that Cloud had a huge thing for Tifa when he was a kid, and it's implied that the two are more than just friends in the compilation, but it's Cloud's issues with self-worth and depression that's ruining their relationship. Tifa fixing Cloud's brain is a massive plot point in the original, and has already been set up for Part 3. I think it would be kind of funny if the writers still leave Tifa and Cloud's relationship completely up to interpretation, but I get the feeling they're going to give us a more definitive yes or no in Part 3. This game really puts Tifa through the ringer. By the ending, she's lost a close friend in Aerith, and she's horrified as she has to watch Cloud slip into madness. Rebirth leans pretty hard into their relationship, which makes it that much more of an effective storytelling method when we see all of Tifa's concerned reactions as the game goes on and Cloud slips further and further away mentally. Let's start from the beginning though. The initial conflict between the two was a really nice change. Since this is a Sephiroth that has knowledge of the past, it makes perfect sense that he'd want to put a wedge between Cloud and Tifa. But it's not just the change that Cloud is being defensive and manipulated to distrust her. In the original, Tifa routinely dodges the subject of Nibelheim throughout the majority of the game. While in Junon on the PS1, Cloud even directly asks Tifa about Nibelheim, only to have her lie and say she doesn't remember. Everyone associates Cloud with being the unreliable narrator, but Tifa fills this role too. The main difference being that Cloud's doing it unintentionally, while Tifa makes an active choice to hide the truth from not just Cloud, but the entire group. She wants to see more of Cloud to try and understand what's going on before she confronts him. Rebirth essentially keeps the same dynamic as the original, but flips their conversations and motives completely upside down. We get a scene where Tifa admits to Aerith that Cloud was never in Nibelheim, something that she keeps to herself for almost the entirety of the original. In Junon this time around, Tifa now actively tries to get information out of Cloud instead of avoiding the situation, bringing up people from their childhood just to see if Cloud remembers, which he quickly realizes is Tifa testing his knowledge of the past. This time, she doesn't try to hide her intentions when Cloud calls her out, but they do have an understanding of each other rather than the argument that happens earlier in Calm. They both know and acknowledge that something's off. It is a weird way to end it though. They go their separate ways and agree to find time to talk about it later. Now seemed like just as good a time as any, but hey, it's still a game and you gotta drag it out a little sometimes. The next big scene between them is when Sephiroth makes Cloud physically attack her in the Gungaga reactor. Tifa manages to dodge the attack, but it knocks her into the lifestream. One of the new weapons then swallows her, but it soon becomes apparent that it's not in a malicious way. We get an early glimpse of the scene where Tifa fixes Cloud, but this time it's focused on Tifa's memories instead. The lifestream is showing Tifa memories that she's forgotten. This isn't just a setup for when Cloud has his breakdown in Part 3 though. This is a way for the planet to keep Tifa on her normal course from the original game. She plays a major role in Cloud's story arc, and the planet makes sure to remind her of the real Cloud who cares about her, and not focus on the person who was just manipulated into attacking her. And Sephiroth doesn't like this. His plan is to drive a wedge between the two of them while the planet needs them together. Sephiroth's first attack is even aimed directly at Tifa while she's inside the weapon. Realizing she's now drowning in the lifestream, the weapon retreats back to the surface to spit her out. When Tifa wakes back up, we get Cloud giving lines of dialogue that Tifa gives in the original. Cloud admits to knowing things he shouldn't and not knowing things he should, that he feels like he has two people living inside of him. On the PS1, Tifa delivers this line as part of her reasoning for never confronting Cloud about his memories. The whole idea of degradation wasn't around as an excuse in the original. For that narrative, Tifa is too confused as to what's going on with Cloud's mind as to really bring it up. She wanted to see more evidence before she broke the news to him. It also doesn't help that Cloud gets his little freakouts and headaches anytime his memories are challenged. This is where Tifa being an unreliable narrator unintentionally helps break Cloud too. Cloud openly admits that Tifa supporting him was the main thing that kept him going. When he doubted himself, he still believed everything was okay because he had Tifa's support. Whereas in Rebirth, Cloud is already very aware that something's wrong with him, as opposed to thinking it's all part of Sephiroth's illusionary magic, like in the original. In the real Cloud's memories, we learn that this event where Tifa fell was really traumatic for him as a kid. He was trying to save Tifa in Mount Nibel because he had a huge crush on her. When the bridge breaks and the two fall, Tifa hits her head and is knocked unconscious, but Cloud is largely okay. In the original, it's Tifa's father that directly blames Cloud too, not just some of the other kids in town who lie about it. For good measure, Cloud is also left behind to fend for himself after Tifa's dad yells at him. This is a huge reason why Cloud goes off to join Soldier, so that if a situation like that ever came up again, that he'd be strong enough to make a difference. And thinking like a little kid with a crush, he also hopes that saving the day and becoming a hero would make Tifa notice him and reciprocate those feelings. We do get the added scene of them almost kissing, but it's ruined by Yuffie and Cait's Sith, while it looks like everyone else was kind of listening in too. There's two bits to point out here. The first being that Tifa says it's her turn to help Cloud. This is foreshadowing her fixing Cloud's brain when they return to the lifestream, and that she now knows it's not just degradation, but that Sephiroth does have some form of direct influence over Cloud. The second point being whatever Aerith says to Tifa. The game blocks out the audio, but Aerith clearly says something to Tifa that we aren't supposed to know yet. I tried looking it up, but no one really seems to know or agree on what it is, so we'll have to wait until the next game for that. I'm not saying it's this exact phrase, but I feel like it's something along the lines of, he remembered, or keep that memory. Tifa and Aerith talk multiple times about Cloud misremembering Nibelheim and everything after, so knowing that Cloud vividly remembers something from their childhood is a big deal. Hell, Tifa goes out of her way to try and pry at Cloud's old memories earlier in the game. Not only that, but it's a memory that Cloud has that Tifa didn't remember from their childhood. In the original, their thought process is that the Cloud we're playing as might be a clone of some sort, that he was created by Hojo after the real Cloud died in Nibelheim or was killed during the subsequent experiments. Tifa diving into Cloud's memories reveals that he wasn't an artificial creation, and that he was the same person she grew up with. I would assume that this is Aerith reassuring Tifa of something similar. We get one last big change between the two of them as well, as Cloud starts to remember Zack. He still doesn't remember it correctly, but he does remember being Zack's friend and them falling from the bridge. This is kind of a small victory for Tifa, but also pretty confusing. Cloud knowing who Zack is a pretty big step. She still has no clue that Cloud was the Shinra grunt who survived the fall, which means she has no idea how he knows about the bridge collapsing in the first place. After what she saw in the livestream, Tifa knows Sephiroth is in Cloud's head, and she recognizes when he's now directly quoting Sephiroth in the cave. But again, still not understanding how Cloud would know about this. She snaps him out of it, and I thought it was a nice touch to have Yuffie back her up too. Yuffie has no idea what's going on, but she correctly reads the room and just goes with Tifa's lie to keep them moving. This is really the beginning of the end for the nice moments between Tifa and Cloud though. The game gives us one last nice scene between them where the roles are reversed. Tifa starts to have a panic attack and it's Cloud that comforts her. Ironically, it's after this scene that we see Tifa start to lose faith in Cloud and little by little stop having the ability to keep him grounded. After Roche turns into a robed man, Tifa can't even keep her head up when she tries to tell Cloud he'll be fine. Once they get to the Temple of the Ancients, every time that Tifa tries to snap Cloud out of it, he gets more and more aggressive in pushing her away. The final time, he literally pushes her away to chase after the black materia. When Cloud's sanity finally breaks in Part 3, I think Tifa completely losing faith in him will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. This will then play further into her motivation to try and find the real Cloud and piece his memories back together. But for now, it's really hard not to feel bad for Tifa at the end of the game. Rebirth goes out of its way to add a lot more depth to their relationship, and not even in the romantic sense, just the two of them genuinely caring for one another. They switched around a lot of the dialogues and the order of some events between the two, and I think it was done very well here. For the rest of this video, let's just run through some of the other changes and see if they were done for better or worse. One that I really liked was Rufus offering Cloud a truce. In the original game, Cloud kinda gets stuck disguising himself as a Shinra soldier while looking for passage to the other continent. Here it's all part of his plan, as he sees it as a way to try and get himself closer to Rufus without raising an alarm. On the PS1, Rufus wasn't made aware of Cloud and the gang being around until they reached Costa del Sol. While it's nothing in the grand scheme of things, I really liked this change here. Rufus wants to propose a ceasefire with Cloud. They stay away from Midgar, leave Shinra alone, and Shinra will also leave them alone. The trade-off being that Rufus wants Sephiroth dead. Rufus is someone that has his hands in everything. This includes Wutai, Avalanche, and his business with the Shinra. The big thing here is that he mentions knowing who Cloud is and being an ex-soldier. Unless Reeve added some fake files, which I don't think is the case, then Rufus likely put 2 and 2 together and figured out that Cloud was the escapee with Zack. Rufus knows that a normal soldier is no match for Sephiroth, so it would make sense of him knowing about Cloud's past, and this is why he believes Cloud could potentially defeat him. Or it could all be a trick to make sure that Cloud keeps following Sephiroth. But Yuffie picks the worst possible time to try her assassination, and Rufus thinks this was all orchestrated by Cloud. It's also very likely this was a monkey's paw style agreement by Rufus though, and he had some secret plan for Cloud had they shaken on the agreement. But let's focus on the fact that Rufus probably knows Cloud's true past. Rufus mentioning that Cloud's file was gripping and enlightening is likely his sly way of revealing this knowledge. Cloud thinks he's a soldier that left Shinra. That's about the extent of his backstory with the company. That's happened countless times in the past as Soldier had a mass desertion event. Soldiers giving up their post is nothing new to the Shinra, and certainly wouldn't be anything Rufus was interested in. Rufus is aware of the robed men being the lead to Sephiroth because he flat out says Hojo told him. That's also a retcon with Hojo here. In Remake, Hojo recognizes Cloud and starts to say that he was never in Soldier before the Whispers drag him away. In the original, when Cloud finally breaks, Hojo deduces that Cloud was one of his experiments and confirms the reunion theory is true, but doesn't specifically know who Cloud is or that he never gave him a numbered tattoo. Hojo is then upset to learn that of all his specimens, what he considered to be a failure was the one who actually proved most vital to the reunion. So it would appear that Hojo shares a lot more information with Rufus this time around, and Hojo is well aware of who Cloud is too. Whether this plays any part in the third game, who knows, but it easily could, seeing as how Rufus and Hojo are present when Cloud breaks and gives the black materia to Sephiroth. Something else that likely won't play a part in the next game, but was a cool addition, was giving the black materia more of a backstory with the Gi. On the PS1, the black materia kinda comes out of nowhere to be a major plot device. I do think this section was added to give the player more context of its history. The Gi flat out say that they can't leave their prison, and that they want to use the black materia, which would destroy the planet. Our party's response is to say, yeah, let's play along for now, but there's no way in hell we're giving that to them. Since the Gi can't leave to try and stop us, and we would have to willingly give it to them, yeah, I think it's all for a bit of backstory on the black materia, the Cetra, and a better path that leads us to the Temple of the Ancients. In the original, after we recruit Sid, he literally just tells us that Rufus mentioned going to the Temple of the Ancients, and that's all the party gets as far as a direction. Adding in this section with the Gi is definitely a much more improved reason to head to the temple. The only way I see them returning in any kind of impactful way is that Sephiroth might have Cloud hand the black materia over to them, and they cast Meteor in his place, but I'm not sure if that's going to be the case. With Sephiroth making so many appearances in Remake and Rebirth, it might come off as anticlimactic if he's not the one to actually summon Meteor. They'll probably get tied in some way or another through side content, but I don't think that the Gi will play a big part in the main story in Part 3. Let's switch gears into a few of the character introductions that I thought were handled much better in Rebirth. I want to start with Vincent. In the original game, I never understood why anyone would like him. His character design was unique, but his personality was bland as could be. He fit in with the backstory of Sephiroth, but he was just such a goddamn bore. In Rebirth, Vincent shows more personality in just his introduction than he does the entirety of the original game, and probably as well as Advent Children, too. In the compilation, Vincent has an extremely dry sense of humor, and I'm glad to see that returning here. But I was not expecting to have a boss fight against him at all, let alone in his Galleon Beast form. Considering I didn't really care about Vincent on the PS1, his introduction here was one of the high points of the game for me. It's an improvement in every imaginable way. I had no expectations, and to be honest, didn't really care about meeting Vincent. Instead, his introduction and boss fight was one of the most memorable moments of the game for me. In the small amount of screen time that he gets, I can't underestimate how much better Vincent already is compared to the original version. Seeing as how Vincent was a former Turk, let's move on to the current ones. These guys are fan favorites for a reason. For being minor characters, they are some of the best written in the entire series. The Turks are not good people, and definitely antagonists, but they still come across as people who have a moral compass, even if their loyalty to Shinra always takes precedent. It doesn't matter what combination that gets presented, the Turks just steal every scene that they're in. Reno and Root are always great, but Elena might be the breakout character of the game. Her voice actress has done a ton of regular acting gigs, but as far as I can tell, this is her first voice acting work, and she absolutely nailed the snarky and confident, but still inexperienced personality of Elena. I'd be very surprised if she didn't get a lot more voice acting jobs in the future. Elena getting a bigger role while Reno was out of commission just fit seamlessly into the game. Just like the Vincent boss fight, I was fucking pumped when it was revealed that we were actually going to fight Song too. That was another one that caught me completely off guard, but was a great addition. I liked seeing more of him too. Even though he's the leader of the Turks, he never got a ton of screen time outside of Crisis Core. Seeing as I don't really know where else to throw this, how cool was it when the second Demon's Gate boss just showed up? After Junon, I completely blitzed the story because I was afraid of spoilers, so my characters and materia were pretty underleveled. But the Temple of the Ancients didn't mess around when it came to having some tough fights. Adding in a fanservice fight like Song, and then surprising the player with fights like Vincent and a second Demon's Gate showing up, is just great game design and writing. Those are the kinds of things that so many remakes get wrong, but Rebirth nailed a lot of it. Yuffie is another character that got a significantly better introduction. Technically being an optional character, she kinda just shows up and then goes off with the party after she's beaten in combat and the correct answers are chosen. Yuffie was much more fleshed out than Vincent though, as she gets all the Wutai side content, and Vincent just gets a flashback. In Rebirth, Yuffie gets even more build up in screen time. She has her own DLC beforehand, and fits into the Junon storyline before actually joining the party in Costa del Sol. While her introduction is definitely improved over the original, this is where I'm going to transition into some of the changes that either fell flat with me or that I just didn't like. I don't mind Yuffie. I actually used her kind of a lot in the original game. My party was usually Cloud, Tifa with the long-range materia, and then a ranged character to also keep in the back row. Since Barrett gets close and long-range weapons, this meant that little by little over the years, I leaned more towards Yuffie. She can be a lot in Rebirth, though. Again, I didn't mind her, but I think some people will. She plays the role of the hyperactive young party member, and because she's always got something to say, that means she gets a lot of screen time. Besides making herself the center of attention just being a character trait of hers, Yuffie's also significantly more popular in Asian countries than she is in America, which probably factored into the amount of screen time that she gets, since Square is a Japanese company. If you're someone that doesn't like her character, you're going to have a decent gripe with this game. I don't think she's as much of a one-note character as a lot of people make her out to be, though. Yeah, she talks about materia a lot, but she does have other characteristics too. Despite always messing with Barrett, she's the first one to stand up for him in Corel, and obviously she's extremely loyal to her home country of Wutai. While she's very loud about materia, there is more to her character than just that. By the end of the game, she's a full-fledged party member, and she's sharing in everybody else's grief over Aerith as well. But I also hope that players didn't mind the running gag about her motion sickness too much. That's going to be shown in full force for Part 3 when the real Cloud makes his appearance. With Wutai as a nation looking to get a much bigger role in the third game, I do look forward to seeing Yuffie get a more fleshed out personality as well, too. Just like Yuffie, I think Nanaki and Cosmo Canyon are going to be pretty divisive with fans too. I always renamed Red 13 to Nanaki in the original, so I'm going to refer to him as that. Even as a little kid, I always thought it was kind of funny how the party learns his real name and then just goes, You're Red 13 still. You've always been Red 13 and not your real name. Personally, I always just thought Nanaki was kind of a boring character, so I never used him much in the original. So I liked how they added a new twist onto his personality, but I completely get it if everyone isn't on board with his new teenager persona. For me though, I think it gives his character some much needed depth while not just sticking to his dull, stoic characterization from the original. He stands out a little more here, whereas he was just kinda forgettable for me before. On a side note, I loved the bait and switch they used with him and Aerith. There's a couple times that you hear Aerith talking to someone, but you don't recognize the voice. Myself and a few of my friends all assumed that this was going to be some asspull, where Aerith is talking to Zack from across timelines, but it's really just her talking to Nanaki in his real voice. There's a narrative term called a shaggy dog story. Basically, this means that an author draws attention towards something, but then purposely makes that reveal underwhelming. Well, Nanaki acts a lot more like a normal dog this time around, and his whole childlike voice with Aerith stuff is just a shaggy dog joke thrown into the narrative. It's a rarely used trope because of how shallow it can come off in a story, but I liked it here. I thought it was kind of funny, but I'd also be lying if I said I wasn't relieved that Aerith wasn't casually talking with dead people. There are going to be people that think it's just stupid or that it's too big of a change with his character, but I think the change fits. Time is relative, and Nanaki still has hundreds of years to live. At the very end of the original, he's 548 years old and doesn't look to be slowing down. His voice isn't just some running gag, as it's also meant to mirror his personality. Nanaki is both knowledgeable and in tune with the planet, but he's also inexperienced and a little naive to the world outside of Cosmo Canyon, despite technically being 48 years old. The Cosmo Canyon stuff in general is likely to be just as divisive. There seems to be a lot of tongue-in-cheek humor here. Bugenhagen is kind of an asshole at first, but I thought it was funny how they made everyone in Cosmo Canyon think they were smarter than they really were. Everyone here wants to save the planet and be an expert, but no one wants to actively do anything or have an open mind about it. I feel like it's the writers making a joke about today's standards where a ton of people love to pretend like they care so much about certain issues, but never actually do anything to actively help. They just bitch and moan online or spread awareness to people that aren't the cause of the problem. I got the feeling Cosmo Canyon was meant as social commentary satire. But all of this is a pretty huge 180 from the original game, where the people of Cosmo Canyon, actually knew things and weren't really smug about it. So I can definitely see why this is going to rub some fans the wrong way. It's a pretty huge change to the lore. One thing I do wish they did change was how Nanaki learned about his father. The whole "we lied and made you hate your dad for like 40 years" thing could have been improved upon really easily in my opinion. Then Bugenhagen saying "go out and learn the truce that I was ignorant to" thing also felt pretty out of place. Like, they were so close. They had the ball lined up on the tee, but they just shit their pants and slipped in it when they got into the batter's box. So they lied to Nanaki and let him believe that his father died a coward. This lie was to protect him because they knew he'd try and enter the cave anyway to see his father. Why not have Nanaki know that his father died fighting the Gi, but leave out that he's a statue there still keeping watch? Let that be the big reveal. When they go through the cave, Nanaki can get the full perspective of just what Seto did to keep everyone safe. If he doesn't know that Seto is petrified there, then he'd have no reason to enter the cave in the first place, and they'd also have no reason to lie to him that his dad was a coward. In both the original game and Rebirth, the reveal that Seto wasn't some coward is insanely predictable, and I was really surprised that they didn't add anything to it this time around. Bugenhagen does reiterate how strong Nanaki has gotten in his own right, but then afterwards, his reasoning for sending Nanaki back out with Cloud and the others is kinda self-aggrandizing. He talks about how he was so wrong about everything, and that Nanaki needs to go out and learn the truce of the world that he was so ignorant to. Like, what the hell kind of motivation is that? Wouldn't it make way more sense to keep the focus on Nanaki's goals? But instead they focus on Bugenhagen's shortcomings. I feel like it would have been way more emotional if, after telling Nanaki how he's become a great warrior too, Bugenhagen said something along the lines of, "Your father saved Cosmo Canyon, but you need to be much more. Your destiny is to help save the planet itself, and that is why you need to continue your journey with Cloud and the others." Then Nanaki can have his same speech, which then still causes his petrified father to start crying. It's only a couple different lines of dialogue, but it's a couple different lines that would make a big difference. I mean, I'm a fucking idiot, and I wrote that in 10 seconds. How professional writers glossed over that and just made Bugenhagen project his faults onto Nanaki is kinda mind-blowing. To me, this scene came off as being more about Bugenhagen admitting he was wrong and getting character growth, instead of it being about the playable main character's motivations. I don't know. Having Bugenhagen tell Nanaki to go out and learn all the things that he was ignorant to, it just seems so out of place. Right now, we're not worried about learning more about the planet. We're worried about keeping it safe from Sephiroth. It's such a small scene, but things like this in games and movies always bug the shit out of me. When something seems so goddamn easy to improve upon, but professional writers let it slip through the cracks. I feel like they just missed the mark with some of the Cosmo Canyon changes. Still one of the best themes in the game, though. Fucking nailed that. The last thing I want to talk about in my part good, part meh section is around Corel and Dyne. Let's start with Corel Prison, and I thought it was changed for the worse. Getting ambushed and beaten up by a bunch of random desert thugs was a very unsatisfying change. If you're going to make the party look weak, do it against real enemies. Make Shinra do it, make Sephiroth do it, make a monster that you're going to fight later as a boss do it. Don't make these random guys do it in a cutscene, and then never give us the chance to get even. Hell, they even imprison everyone, and we don't even put up any kind of resistance. For as ridiculous as Final Fantasy VIII's story is, when they need to escape from a prison, they even recognize that the guy who fights with his bare hands is a huge asset. Kinda feel like Tifa and Nanaki could do some damage without weapons here. Not to mention that Cloud literally still has his sword during these scenes. And I don't want to hear, well, everyone around them has guns, they had to listen. Are we really gonna pretend like Shinra hasn't been shooting at us in gameplay and in cutscenes for 2 full games? The party just loses all their backbone and goes along with it because the plot demands it. It's bad, cliche writing. If it wasn't bad enough that they make our party look really wimpy, they also already beat the shit out of Dyne and leave him tied up in a shack somewhere. Grade A storytelling here. Just neuter a threatening, emotional boss fight before it even happens. Dyne's supposed to be this loose cannon murderer now, but he also stood no chance against these random thugs too. Like, why the fuck are Gus's guys this tough? Maybe we should start working with Gus to help stop Sephiroth, for Christ's sake. It makes the protagonist of the game and the upcoming antagonist of Dyne look really, really weak. It's pretty bad writing. In the original, Dyne's a problem in Corel Prison, and Gus, or Mr. Coates as he's known in that game, is glad to hear that he's dead. When Barret threatens him, Gus is also afraid of Barret, and the only reason we comply with the Chocobo race is because it's a rule that needs to be followed whether Gus is alive or not to enforce it. This time, we're doing the Chocobo race just to pay off Gus. 'Cause, you know, letting him and his men kick our ass and imprison our party means that we should then give him money for doing that. Our main characters and a character like Dyne should be tougher than these random guys living in a desert. During Corel Prison and Rebirth, our party is constantly just eating shit from people and then thanking them for such a big helping. For me, this was the second worst part of the game. The stuff with Barret and Dyne is a little more complicated though. Up until Final Fantasy XVI, Square has always been adamant about keeping the mainline games rated teen, which meant this was a section that had to be changed for the modern times. The most glaring offense being that Dyne throws himself off a cliff after his fight with Barret. YouTube still flags that big S word, just like the ESRB would likely have flagged the game with a mature rating if they added in Dyne doing that. On the PS1, Dyne's essentially a watch the world burn style character, but he also talks about how he's going to kill Barret, and then go to Midgar and let Marlene join her mom. Yeah, Dyne talking about shooting his 4-year-old daughter isn't gonna fly with that teen rating either. Changes had to be made, but I do think parts of the interactions with Dyne and Barret are very well done in Rebirth. Let's start with them emphasizing how Barret really pushed for the reactor to be built in Corel. In the original, Barret was just one of many people who wanted it, so it didn't make a lot of sense for everyone who survived to blame specifically Barret. Showing him as the one spearheading the support to build the reactor is a much needed fix to the plot. This time around, Dyne isn't just on a rampage, he's batshit crazy. At first, I thought him talking about their dead families was just Dyne talking shit to Barret and rubbing salt in their wounds. But Barret's reaction, and more specifically, Dyne not being initially hostile, show that he really has just lost it. It's only when Dyne recognizes Cloud's soldier uniform and assumes that Barret has ties to the Shinra that he gets fully aggressive. After their fight, Dyne kinda calms down again, but it's clear that this version of Dyne is completely unhinged. He talks about how it's not Barret's fault, but that he doesn't care. He has memories of Marlene, but quickly then blames Barret for taking her from him, and that he wants to die, but can't do it himself. Every moment of clarity that he has is followed by a wild swing of insanity. He's cognizant enough to know that Marlene can't see him like this, but then he starts to frantically try and wipe blood off his hands like he really sees it in that moment. His final actions and words follow this same trajectory. He throws Barret to the side in order to save him from Shinra gunfire, but there's no reconciliation. Dyne collapses on Barret and tells him to carry his guilt forever, before smiling as he's finally put out of his misery. I've seen a lot of people online complaining about the inconsistencies here, but that's the exact point of the situation. After everything that's happened to him, Dyne is psychotic. This isn't the watch the world burn style Dyne from the original. This version is dealing with literal psychosis and flips between moments of clarity and moments of insanity. Saving Barret and then not forgiving him is right in line with every other bit of dialogue he has leading up to this. I actually think this retelling of the Dyne situation is a lot sadder than the original. Barret was in a no-win situation here. Before he can even get Dyne out of the chair and onto his feet, Barret knows that something's seriously wrong with Dyne, but he keeps trying. I wasn't big on Shinra showing up during Barret and Dyne's moments, but without Dyne committing the big S, they needed a segue to get the party out of the desert. So, I really didn't like how we got there with Gus, and I would have been much more okay with Shinra showing up after everything between Barret and Dyne was resolved, but I thought the scenes between Barret and Dyne directly were really well done. But everything they added or changed didn't land quite as well. Let's look at a change that I wasn't big on, and I think we all know where this is going. Cait Sith fucking sucks. I didn't like him in the original game, I didn't like him in Dirge of Cerberus, I didn't like that they threw him in during the plate falling in Remake, and I don't like him in Rebirth. I will fully admit, his voice acting is very well done, and some of the animations on himself and the Moogle look fantastic. But for me, that's where the positives stop. I did not enjoy him in combat at all either. I thought he was by far the worst character to fight with. I will fully acknowledge that apparently he's a bit of an acquired taste, and if you figure out his moves, he can be a very powerful support character, but I didn't even want to get to that point. It's not even just his character that I didn't like, but also his section of the game. Again, just my opinion, but the Shinra Manor is the single worst part of Rebirth, and I don't think it's even close. The pacing is terrible, the throwing mechanics are awful, and his Moogle moves around the map considerably slower than any other playable character. Cait Sith has always been a love him or hate him style character, and that trend seems to be continuing in Rebirth. There are plenty of people out there who enjoy him, so don't take my opinion as gospel, but god damn it, I can't stand this character for some reason. But it's not just my dislike of Cait Sith that makes this section bad. There's a lot of Chapter 11 in general that just isn't very good. I think they completely botched the town of Nibelheim as a whole. The original Return to Nibelheim had a much more sinister tone. The town was rebuilt and stocked with Shinra employees as a cover-up for what Sephiroth did. Despite Cloud and Tifa calling them out, these planted employees would stick to their stories and refuse to acknowledge anything from the town's destruction, all while we see more robed men than at any other prior point in the game. The Shinra Manor itself was a creepy setting. Sephiroth appears much less in the PS1 game, so finding him in the basement only to mock us about something called the Reunion felt ominous. You could read files in the library that were the first foreshadowings of what really happened to Cloud and Zack as they were experimented on in that very basement. Even being able to find where Zack used his fingernails to scratch messages into the test tube's glass to try and communicate with Cloud. The original Final Fantasy VII flipped between serious and goofy at will, but Nibelheim and the Shinra Manor were definite examples of the game's serious side. I mean, hell, just listen to each game's soundtrack for this section. In Rebirth, we get Cait Sith running around looking for a computer and a bunch of helpful Shinra employees telling us that Nibelheim is now a Mako poisoning treatment facility. I didn't like the Shinra Manor except for Vincent, I didn't like the changes to Nibelheim, and I didn't like playing as Cait Sith, but at least I remembered all about those. Without looking it up, I can't even tell you why we needed Murasaki's keycard in the first place. Whether it's for better or worse, at least I remember the rest of the chapter. When I can't remember the purpose of a newly added story element that the game focuses on for several hours, that's the true sign that it wasn't a good payoff. But let's switch back to my unhealthy hatred of Cait Sith, though. Before we learned that he was a fully playable character, I was really holding out hope that he would just pop in from time to time and the focus would be much more on Reeve as a character than it was on Cait Sith. Didn't get my wish on that at all. I think Reeve is a pretty intriguing character. Someone who has ties to both Shinra and the heroes, but also doesn't fully agree with the methods of either side. Obviously, he doesn't agree with most of Shinra's decisions, but he also feels like he can do more good being on the inside of the company. He's a character that's stuck between a rock and a hard place and just trying to do what he thinks is the right move. Sign me up for more of that. But instead, we get an annoying, wisecracking cat riding a stuffed animal that we're supposed to act like is a real person. I would have been 100% on board with more of Reeve, the person, having a much bigger role. But despite Reeve being the one who controls Cait Sith, I feel like there's no connection at all between Reeve as a character and Cait Sith as a character. I could go on for a lot longer, but you get the point. The return to Nibelheim, Shinra Manor, and Cait Sith in general are the worst parts of the game for me. I think everyone can, again, guess where I'm going to next. Cid isn't really Cid anymore. Look, everyone knew that he was going to be a lot different than his original counterpart. No one should be surprised that he got a pretty big overhaul. Back in the 90s, people thought it was funny how he was verbally abusive towards Shara, and how she would just constantly apologize for it. In 2024, that's not source material that aged very well. There's no way in hell they could have brought 1997 Cid into a modern-day Final Fantasy game. Sure, there are characters like Don Corneo, Hojo, and the Turks who do much, much worse things than Cid, but they all have a bit more of a cut-and-dry fictional side that the writers could work with when recreating them. Most people in the real world won't interact with mobsters, mad scientists, and hitmen during their lives, so it's much easier to get away with portraying characters like that because it's not relatable in the slightest. Cid, on the other hand, was probably seen as a little too realistic. Right now, someone is typing out a comment, calling me a pussy, or telling me to toughen up. First off, calm down, angry internet person that I just made up. Secondly, I'm not arguing for or against it. I'm just telling you the way the fucking world works now, and I'm looking at this through the scope of modern social cues. Cid and Shara's relationship, and by result, Cid's backstory, just isn't cool to a lot of people in 2024. Something like the Persona games could definitely pull it off, but not a modern Final Fantasy. With all that said, I did still expect Cid to feel a little more like Cid. In Rebirth, he just feels bland. In a cast full of such unique personalities, he feels extremely generic. He's just another cliche, country boy, mechanic-style character. But it's not just his personality that was going to need to be updated. His whole introduction in the original never made a lot of sense to me. So, Rufus and the Shinra show up to Rocket Town because they need to use his tiny Bronco airplane. They've been looking for Sephiroth in the wrong direction, and apparently only the tiny Bronco can get them there. Throughout the game, Rufus has dozens of different helicopters and airships at his disposal, so singling out the tiny Bronco never made much sense. Cid then joins the party because he thinks we're numbskulls for challenging the Shinra, and Cid likes numbskulls. Cid worked for Shinra as a pilot, but he never had any ties whatsoever to President Shinra, Rufus, Sephiroth, Avalanche, Shinra's military, or saving the planet. So they were going to need to change the backstory as well. Having him know Aerith's mother while he worked for the Shinra isn't a bad start. It at least gives him a reason to continue on with the group, instead of just enjoying the company of numbskulls. But until we see Rocket Town, we don't even know if being the first person in space is still in Cid's backstory, because all he mentions was fixing up stuff around the Shinra building, and I can definitely see the huge materia plot being cut content in Part 3. I will be interested to see where they go with Sid from here though. Whatever it is, I just hope they make him a little more interesting, because Rebirth Sid is pretty forgettable in the short amount of screen time that he gets. I hate to end it on a downer, but I really don't feel like reformatting 26 pages of script at this point. Rebirth is a great game, and arguably the best single-player Final Fantasy that we've gotten since the original Final Fantasy VII came out. We'll have to wait another couple years to really judge the narrative as a whole, and see if anyone is even remotely close to being correct in their theories, and I am still on board for now with the changes. But I also don't blame people for being upset about those same changes. Like I started off with in the beginning of this video, the first two parts of the remake trilogy aren't what people were expecting. There are literally millions of people that wanted a true, modern remake that expanded on the characters, but instead the new plot changes just made them tap out. You can't fault anyone for taking that stance, and when I first beat Remake, I was in that exact same mindset. The timing of introducing a multiverse right after Marvel and DC have been beating it into everybody's head over and over again didn't really help either. They started writing this plot like a decade ago, so it's unfortunate, but a lot of people are just tired of the time travel and multiverse plots in general right now. But if you can separate the original game from the remake trilogy, it makes it a lot easier to accept the changes that are being presented to us. Between everything in the main story, a really fun combat system, and over 100 hours worth of content, Rebirth has to be recognized as the early frontrunner for Game of the Year. Let's just pray to whatever god you may or may not believe in, that they don't fuck up the ending. This one was even longer than my usual marathon-length videos, so if you made it this far, thank you very much, and I do hope you enjoyed it. You know all about the like, comment, and subscribe stuff. Do so if you feel like it. It always helps the channel and lets me know if you give a shit about my videos. Sorry this one took forever to make, but I just had a lot of other stuff going on that meant I didn't get a lot of time to work on this for like 2 months straight, and I finally switched over to a better editing program, so the learning curve added even more time on top of that. But anyway, that's all I've got for now. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like to hear about from Final Fantasy VII, or just any game in general you'd like to recommend a video for. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you back. Later, guys.